Said political activists trying to build a better world need optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. And by that, pessimism of the intellect means that we need to see the world as it really is, eyes wide open. And optimism of the will means at the same time maintaining hope and the will to make change. Tonight we have with us two authors who can help us think deeper about how do we confront the reality of the climate crisis and at the same time maintain hope for a better world in which we address climate change and social justice issues. Manjula Martin is author of The Last Fire Season, A Personal and Pyronatural History. The book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award in Autobiography. She also has a forthcoming anthology called Red Flag Warning, Mutual Aid and Survival in California's Fire Country. And then our second author is Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a U.S. science fiction writer. His most recent books are The Ministry for the Future and a nonfiction book, The High Sierra, A Love Story. Ministry for the Future is a science fiction story about planet Earth dealing with climate change. Our format tonight, each author is going to talk for about 15 minutes about their work. We asked them to talk on the theme of radical visioning and imagination and the climate movement today. After speaking about their work, the authors will have a chance to ask each other questions and dialogue. And then we will open it up for your questions in the chat.
My book, The Last Fire Season, is a memoir. It came out last year. It's a combination of several different modes of writing. It combines natural history and reporting with personal, more lyrical writing about body and place and memory, all within the context of the wildfire crisis here in California. I wanted to read a bit from my book because I think it really addresses what Carlos was talking about. One thing that I would imagine Stan and I both get at events is whenever I'm talking about climate change, people always want to talk about hope. They always want to say, like, how can I find hope? And I think that's a very valid emotion. And it's something that we're all kind of looking for, I think, especially right now. And so this is a bit in my book where I talk about the idea of hope and how we might temper that with a little bit of reality also. I think the only thing you need to know for this passage is the book interweaves the story of the 2020 wildfire season in Northern California, which is where I live, with a personal crisis that I experienced at the same time, a health crisis that led to my having chronic pain. So it's very much a story about the ways in which living with fire and living with pain sort of play off of each other and inform one another, and how both of those experiences changed my perspective on the natural world and my relationship with it. And the other thing you need to know is that the person I'm talking to in this scene is my partner, who is a community organizer, who works with immigrant and low-wage workers who are on the front lines of the effects of climate change. Would you ever make a thank you firefighters sign for our house? I asked Max. Absolutely, he said, but mine would say thank you volunteer firefighters. Our volunteer fire department consisted of about 10 people, all of whom had other full-time jobs. They worked hard. What about a hashtag sign? I said. A what? You know, hashtag West County Strong or whatever. Absolutely not. We were driving in the country outside the town of Healdsburg, which the Wallbridge fire had almost burned into a couple of months earlier, and the Kincaid fire had almost burned into the prior year. The signs were now a year-round fixture all over California. Thank you messages, often accompanied by cute stick figure drawings of houses and families, big, bold marker in all caps on cardboard. Thank you, first responders. Hashtag Sonoma Strong. Hashtag Hope Wins. In recent years, the language of survival had taken on a strange homogeneity. After any disaster or any terror incident, the signs went up. The formula was usually hashtag plus town plus strong. In general, offline use of handwritten hashtags unsettled me. Hashtags were for brands or trends. Whether organic or optimized, a hashtag was a thing intended to be aspirational. The words it prefaced marketed as desirable, packaged for consumption, as though a person should want to have an occasion to be hashtag strong. Is that really what we're going for? Continued Max, in the face of climate change, being strong? That's all we got? I agreed. It wasn't only the hashtag that was the problem. Fire, especially of all so-called natural disasters, seemed to inspire a fetish for strength. Such declarations of strength felt to me a bit like a desperate assertion more than a show of solidarity. I mean, Max said, someone is printing up those stickers and signs. People are buying them. This is how capitalism gobbles itself up. Like, let's take the act of surviving an event that is the direct result of the ravages of capitalism and make it into a slogan. Wildfire, as an extreme weather-driven event, was a literal demonstration of humanity's weakness, both acutely and in the big picture. I understood the hashtags espoused a metaphorical strength and that people needed something to keep going emotionally. But in that context, strength implied rigidity, which meant not changing. Rarely light on their feet, the strong. It's like how people talk about cancer, I said, like it's a battle, we'll fight it, we'll win. Max shifted his posture in the driver's seat, and Susan Sontag spun in her grave again. The road wound through alternating patches of sun and shade, grapevines and oak trees. Hashtag hope, all the signs read. Lately, any discussion of the realities of climate change in any locale inevitably ended in an invocation of hope. I never knew what to say when people talked about hope. It wasn't really a concept that resonated with me. As much as I craved a future I could look forward to, the version of reality in which communities rebounded strongly, time after time, from disaster after disaster, was not exactly a hopeful one. The prospects seemed kind of grim. Do you think that I'm hopeless? I asked. I was definitely the pessimist in our pairing. No, there's still hope for you yet, he said. Haha. I mean, like a person who does not have hope. I don't know if I have hope. He considered it. I think he said that hope is maybe the wrong word for right now. But I do feel hopeless about the fires, I said, about the climate. I know, he said, but I don't actually think you're a person without hope. It's more that instead of just hoping, you understand that we need to be engaging with what's going on. I guess the problem with hope as a goal is that it usually stops there. Hope, the way people use it with the hashtag and everything, implies a return to normalcy, like a fixed solution. And that usually translates into doing the same shit as always, but expecting different results. This was also said to be a definition of insanity. Max was an organizer. He spent every day with working class people who had wild hope, the kind of hope that drove mass social change. The hope the workers had was different from hashtag hope. It was more of a belief that things could change, that people could change them because it had to change. Over and over, people with little reason to hope, people brutalized by economics, power dynamics, inherited trauma, challenged the most powerful structures and people in their lives, bosses, politicians, entire institutions. That kind of hope, Max continued, isn't about replicating some imagined normalcy. It's about trying to change things, even though you know you might not win. I fiddled with the car radio, classic rock again. There must be a way, I thought, of moving forward in chaos that did not require fealty to a long exhausted cliche. A couple of weeks before his writing studio burned down, and a few months before he died of cancer, the writer Barry Lopez wrote in Orion magazine that he had begun to back away from the false promise of hope in the era of climate change. He advocated shifting from optimistic denial to a kind of loving realism. If we are to manage the havoc, he wrote, we have to reimagine what it means to live lives that matter, or we will only continue to push on with the unwarranted hope that things will work out. The only way to do this, he said, was to stop pretending the future would be rosy and to embrace fearlessly the burning world. In 2014, when the weather had been noticeably changing, but disasters had still appeared to be occasional, I read an article that has often come to mind in the years since. In a short interview in a now shuttered magazine, environmental journalist Brooke Jarvis had interviewed Chris Jordan, an artist whose work focused on human waste and the environment. Jordan had shot a photography project on Midway Island in the North Pacific, where albatrosses breed and where human pollution caused baby albatrosses to die en masse in the nest. While nesting, the juvenile birds could only eat what their parents brought them, which was increasingly plastic trash. And so they'd often starve to death before they fledged, their corpses rotting and leaving only bones and feathers in a haunting circle around the non-biodegradable contents of their stomachs. These remains were what he photographed. In the article, he spoke of how depressing it had been to tour schools and communities and show these photos. Everywhere he went after his presentation, he was approached by audience members in tears, distraught. What could they do about this tragedy? They asked him. How could they find in his images some sense of hope? That's not actually my job, Jordan said to Jarvis. His job as an artist was to witness and then to make something that might help his viewers sit with the truth of what was happening. In this way, Jordan's artwork was in part an exercise in grief, solastalgia in practice. Only by really sitting with the reality of these birds' lives, the horrible death, the species decline, yes, but also the other wonderful things he'd seen on Midway, the wild beauty in their domestic lives, their sweeping flight arcs, only then could people proceed towards something resembling hope. In the interview, he called the feeling he had observing the birds, the same feeling he was hoping to inspire in viewers, an ecstatic sadness. I liked that better than hope. We were now within the city limits of Healdsburg, a former agricultural town that had in recent decades been reinvented as a wine country destination. The car inched in towny traffic past tasting rooms and luxury hotels. A new construction project was going up, luxury condos on the site of an old mill. There was a sign with a computer-generated picture of light-filled, high-ceiling lofts surrounding a courtyard. In the picture, the sun was shining and white people were doing leisure activities. The stoplight turned green, and as we accelerated, I noticed the ad's tagline, #WineCountryLiving. I don't think you're hopeless at all, Max kept going. But that word is kind of played out. I think the real word we're looking for, even though it's loaded for a lot of people, is faith. I knew what he meant, but since my own recovery had ended in my not being recovered, I had been wary of that word too. Concepts of hope and faith had little to do with my experience of living in a damaged body on a damaged planet. Since the night of the lightning, I had become much more interested in the vulnerable chaos of uncertainty, the messy, perpetual present tense that my Buddhist therapist encouraged me to think of as being with pain instead of being in pain. Being with pain was like living with fire, in that sometimes it propelled me into new awareness and connection, and sometimes it sucked. Both manners of living with uncontrollable events required me to let go of any sense of an ending. Living with and within chaotic natural bodies proved to me the lie of a fixed destination. Since the early days of my injuries, I had learned that gunning hard for specific outcomes was a bad way to live. Technically, the word hope simply meant expectation. It didn't necessitate salvation. Max took his hands off the steering wheel and gestured to the burned hills. Something has happened here, he said. He meant wildfires, climate change, looming sixth extinction, all that. And, he continued, the hashtag kind of hope cheapens the complexity of what has happened. It cheapens the care we need to show for each other and for nature right now. The problem with that kind of hope, he said, is that it still imagines that we're in control. I thought of my experiments with control and faith in my garden. I had initially been tempted to see my experience of finding renewal in gardening while I was in recovery from medical harm as a redemptive arc, like in a movie. You cue the music. In a world without hope, one woman finds comfort in nurturing plants, bringing forth new life into this difficult world to heal herself and maybe, just maybe, unlock the key to healing the planet in the process. The emotional tenor of such a pitch was broadly applicable to my experience. I did feel the high of creation when I was in a garden. When a rose blossom first asserted itself and then dozens of its kind followed, I became giddy with their scent, that adorable pink. Renewal, semper virens, hashtag self-care. Although I found the act of gardening to be revitalizing, the sweet scent of my Jude the Obscure rose bush wasn't going to change the fact that one day it would burn. Gardening was less an embodiment of hope or faith and more of an object lesson, in understanding that every action and the idea of forward progress itself was complicated. You cut a thing, you fed a thing, there was water, beauty, sweet, sweet fruit. Sometimes it went wrong. Mostly it didn't. There was no redemption here, only an ongoing act of livingness, a refusal to stop tending to a life. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Stan, it's your turn.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Manjula. I'm going to try to quickly run through latest thoughts of what's going on right now. It seems to me we're in a time of headwinds and a general sense of retreat from the more promising time of just even 3 years ago, when after COP26 there were agreements by banks and investment and hedge fund firms to go green and to promise to make green investments, and governments were taking their promises at the COP meetings pretty seriously, including at Glasgow, and indeed they have since. The meetings continue, and at every meeting more promises are made, but it's becoming more and more obvious that back home, the nation state governments that have sent representatives to the COP meetings, and those representatives have made promises that are approved back home, but then promises are just promises, and there's a lot of broken promises going on. I gesture at an explanation for such a rapid change. Right now, we have all of the banks leaving that agreement, and we have our own current administration leaving the Paris Agreement. And I think in the 3 years, what's happened is 21 was in the middle of the pandemic, and we believed then that the biosphere could, in fact, stop civilization and kill a lot of us. 1 out of 1,000 people died in that pandemic, and it could have been a whole lot worse if it wasn't for a fairly effective, if chaotic, rapid response from the scientific community and even from the governmental community and from everybody, because they were scared for their lives. So after that, there was repression, forgetting. It's hard to remember 2020 and 21, especially how it felt. And now that we're out of that and somehow feeling impervious again, there's a falling away from reality, the reality of us putting 40 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, and that adding about 4 points per million of CO2 to the atmosphere every year, and us crossing the 1.5 limit of temperature that we promised we'd try to stay below, and then 2-degree coming fast. So it's a tough time, I think. And I just want to remind everybody that there are still good people in all these branches, in governments like the UK or the EU as a supranational government, in B Corps, businesses of all kinds who want to do make a living, even make a profit doing green work, even some billionaires who are hardcore Democrats doing their best to combat climate change. It's a mixed picture. And all around the world, we see contrary winds blowing against each other and creating a kind of chaos. I want to suggest that's going to go on. That will continue for the rest of our lives, but in particular until we get to new administration in the United States, and a renewed sense that reality bites, that you can't wish it away and you can't ignore it. And I will add one more element of our systemic life that is not going to ignore it, and that's reinsurance companies. The capitalist companies that are at the end of the stick when it comes to payouts for climate damage, they're taking it seriously. And so the battle will go on. And I just want to say thank you, Fossil Free California and all of its members, because I think you've gotten precisely at the crucial issue, and I want to explain why. This retreat from reducing emissions has been quite serious, and there is a lot of talk about geoengineering to kind of ameliorate the damage that we can see is going to happen. Um, for those of you interested in knowing the full picture in its darkest manifestation, I have to recommend to you a new book by Jean-Baptiste François. There's a good comprehensive review of it by Adam Tooze that's probably on his Substack, and it's also in the London Review of Books, so you don't have to read all of François, which is oppressive in its detailing of how badly we are doing at transitioning to a clean energy systems, and how the clean transition, although there is an awful lot of solar and wind being put online now, and that's great, and that is crucial and one of the good things to look at, it's mostly accumulative to fossil fuels, which helps to make the solar gear, which never really has, to this point, gone down very much. And he shows historically that every time we have a new energy system, rather than replacing the previous one in transition mode, it's merely accumulative and all of it goes on. It's pretty scary stuff, and I just want to reassure people that it's good to start from reality, but also this is a history, not an inevitable trajectory. So in other words, his book goes up to about 1990, or it could even come up to the present. It doesn't matter. We still have to decarbonize now, no matter what the past did. So focusing in on fossil free is the right focus. And when people talk about, well, the various geoengineering schemes that are out there, I think it's worth considering all of them and even thinking of swapping out away from fossil fuel burning as a geoengineering technique, keeping it in the ground, calling all those fossil fuels still in the ground stranded assets, and coping with that. That's the sine qua non. Without it, nothing. So even if you're interested in the other geoengineering methods being proposed, which I am, they only exist as auxiliary to the sine qua non, which is ending emissions of fossil fuels to the atmosphere. If we don't do that, most of the rest of them will be ineffective and irrelevant. The classic image of putting a Band-Aid on a cancer patient. I will add that the one that I'm interested in the most, which is seeing if we can tack down the gigantic ice sheets of Antarctica and not let them float off, is partly because even if we were to do everything right, starting right now, even if emissions reductions were being intensely pursued by everybody in the world, which we know they're not, but if they were, we have still baked enough heat into the oceans to put sea level at risk. If the big ice sheets in West Antarctica come off, then sea level could rise 4 meters, 6 meters. And this is radical and severe, perhaps a civilization crusher. So could be labeled geoengineering, but I'm going to say this, it's worth exploring anyway, because even in best case scenarios, we have already in an overhang, you might call it. There's an overhang problem. We solved the emissions problem. We switched to clean energy. We've still got a sea level problem that might be approachable. And in general, we're in a carbon dioxide overshoot. Let's put it that way. That's what the next few centuries should be named, the carbon dioxide overshoot. Approximately 80 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, more than there ought to be, and we need to suck it back down. So carbon drawdown geotechneering techniques are different than cooling the planet geoengineering techniques. That being the case, the carbon drawdown being necessary, reforestation, regenerative agriculture, kelp beds, various ocean manipulations to draw carbon into the ocean more, sink it to the bottom. The whole litany of possible carbon drawdown methods you've probably already heard, and I just want to say all of them are worth investigation because we may have to employ all of them. There's not a single one of them that would be adequate by itself to get as much CO2 down as we need to get down. And not only that, but we put so much up there. This project will take Decades for sure, maybe a couple centuries to get it back down to a safer level. And I used to say, kind of in a non-reflective fashion, we need to get it back down to 350 parts per million, partly because of Bill McKibben's great group, partly because that used to be the high point in our parts per million in an oscillation that's lasted for the last million years. But you know what? If we can get it down even back to 400, or if we can just start it going down from our own efforts, then we may save ourselves from a runaway greenhouse effect. So carbon drawdown methods are good too, but they are secondary to reducing emissions and stopping emissions. And that's why your organization is so important and so on the right topic here. So stopping emissions. I want to mention the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm sure you're all aware of it. And it is a wonderful piece of work. And some nation states have signed on because we are in a nation state system, and this is going to be one country at a time. The really significant one was Colombia because they're the fifth biggest coal producer on this planet. And when Petra and Marquez were elected, they said to the world, we're going to stop, we're going to keep it in the ground, we're going to stop mining and selling our fossil fuels. So we need your help. And then they did not get any help. Okay, this is significant and where we have to wave the flags and fight. What they should have had at that point is financial help from the rest of the world. I'm thinking of not just kind of symbolic gestures like the carbon coin is a symbol in my novel Ministry for the Future, but things like the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights, which are designed for the IMF to essentially give money away to countries in distress. Now, that's partly so they can pay their debts back to the IMF and the World Bank, but it also helps them from falling apart. And for sure, that's one mechanism through which the world ought to have paid Colombia a lot of money, and I say billions of dollars for sure, to help them to make the green transition and to afford and to take the financial blow that comes from them agreeing to stop burning their fossil fuels. That would have encouraged other countries to do the same. The failure there is one of the great failures of the last 3 or 4 years. What you would want to see is when a country signs that fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and the extractive industry transparency initiative, the EITI, then money ought to flow into them. And that can come from international sources like the World Bank or the IMF, or it can come from a consortium of central banks or the big central banks, the EU, also billionaire clubs throwing in. Billions are unfortunately a magnitude too small for the problem that we have, which really is going to cost trillions. But it would be great if countries that are sticking their neck out as early volunteers to do the right thing get rewarded for that by the other people who believe in the right thing. Hasn't happened, but it could happen. Other good countries, the United Kingdom is surprisingly, in some senses, gone hard for a quick reduction of emissions from their country, and they are an oil power, a petrostate, and the European Union hangs in there. You also could see very hopeful signs for the clean transition out of desperate countries like Brazil and India, or semi-desperate but incredibly rich and powerful countries like China. They're desperate environmentally. They're desperate to a certain extent socially to reduce poverty, etc. But they're also desperate for not torching the planet because of where they are and their own ecological situations as countries. So I think that that's what I had prepared to say. Maybe I can finish because I have a little tiny bit of time here before I get back to Manjula. Manjula, the the COP system, they'll meet again in Brazil, and Brazil will host it this November in Belém, Brazil, in the Amazon. And that will be an opportunity. Although people use the COP meetings as a way to complain that we aren't going fast enough, which is true. The structure of the COP meetings means that they can only go at a certain glacial speed because they rely on complete consensus. The document signed at the end of every one of these meetings has to have been signed off by every country, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, the usual suspects for people dragging their heels on this issue. And yet the COP can't go ahead without them. There might be some revisions to the COP process this year. I'm involved with that and will be mostly reporting on it. But what we can see happening in Brazil is last meeting in Azerbaijan, they agreed to put $300 billion into a newly created fund to compensate countries that have been damaged, a loss and damage fund, already a big part of Paris. But the actual fund was created in Egypt, and then it was filled by promises in Baku. Can it be filled by actual dollars? And I say dollars on purpose because that is the benchmark currency of this world. That's the one that everybody is it's the imperial coin, and it's the best way to talk about it is US dollars. This cannot be a cryptocurrency, for instance. So who's going to put it in there, and will they put it in there at all? And will it get distributed out to countries that maybe sign on to these non-proliferation treaties and also the EITI, which is basically promising for clean government, that the money doesn't get stolen or sent off somewhere else, but is used for the purposes that it's been received for. So I would say if you can peer through the fog and the spectacle, the fireworks of commentary that erupts around all of these COPs and look for this, does some real money fill that fund this coming November? Is the rule changed that it has to be consensus by then? And might that be one of the fights? And also with the United States, they said immediately on day one, Trump said the U.S. was leaving the Paris Agreement. Absurd and stupid, but it also is just starting a process supposed to take a year. So really, we're in it until next January 20th. What that means in November might be interesting to watch. There will certainly be American nonprofits, American business people, American philanthropists and billionaires, and American activists there representing for the country in the absence of our idiot in chief. So as you know, the fight is never going to be over in our lifetimes. And maybe I can shift it over here and end by remarking to Manjula about hope. I now think that hope is biological, and it's at the cellular level, and that we also call it hunger. So this phrase, where there's life, there's hope, it's right. The two are synonyms. What is life? Well, it's the system that tries to keep itself alive. Well, what is that trying to keep itself alive? We could just call that hope, right? I mean, hope is just an aspect of living, and there's distinctions to be made here, and maybe they're pointless and semantic, and maybe they're more maybe they're more important than that. Optimism versus hope versus determination versus anger. I mean, do our emotional sets really matter? I mean, maybe we have to do the work in a complete feeling of despair but on the other hand, isn't meaning, if your life has meaning, even if you're somehow on the losing end, isn't it the case that it's better off than just being a happy consumer, thoughtlessly going through the motions that capitalism set for you? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, both of you. Lots of material to conjure and think about. So now we're going to start our dialogue, and Manjula gets to ask the first question of Stan, and then Stan asks the question back. So take it away.
Thank you, Carlos. I was revisiting your book, Ministry from the Future, and it's tremendous, obviously, and very uncanny to look at now in some ways. And I was thinking about, one thing I love about your work is that you're very good at sort of all these details. You're good at understanding the policy, the logistics, like the bureaucracy of how we can actually be accomplishing these goals. And it is, a very sort of utopian vision. You've called yourself a utopian novelist before. Um, all of which I very much appreciate. And I think I was thinking about there's a famous quote by the writer Amitav Ghosh, who wrote an essay about how literature has failed to address the climate crisis. And first of all, he wrote this in 2016. So things have changed since then. Obviously, work like yours, your entire body of work is sort of an argument against that. But I do think that he has a point in talking about how in addition to sort of all of the actual things we need to be doing and fighting for in order to get off fossil fuels, there is a cultural and like a literary component, the literature and the culture needs to also shift in some way. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. Like, how are you seeing culture shift, or how would you like to see culture shift? Has that changed for you since, say, 2020?
Well, maybe, and thanks for that. I didn't like Ghosh's book. He's a wonderful novelist. I didn't like
Yeah,
that essay in that book because he erased science fiction as
totally.
a legitimate genre. And all along, climate fiction has been a part of science fiction, going back to J.G. Ballard in the 1960s.
Absolutely.
And really, the beginning of science fiction, one story to tell has been the destruction of the planet, everything from H.G. Wells to various novels of Verne's, by ecological inattention of human beings. So climate fiction has always been there. And it's an unfortunate thing that mainstream culture put down science fiction for a long time. Now that seems to me mostly over. Climate fiction is everywhere. It's well read. A science fiction novel won the Booker Prize last year. People are still somewhat scared to say those two words together because it certifies you as some kind of a nerd or a lunatic. But since everybody's living in a science fiction novel now, acceptance has grown, and climate fiction is the main form of near future science fiction because it's an overriding situation. And there's an awful lot of good climate fiction being written now and read in what used to be thought of as literary fiction, which now begins to look very small and domestic and inward and escapist. In other words, what Ghosh was saying, oh, these people aren't doing their jobs, he was just looking at the wrong part of the literary landscape out of a kind of a snobbery or a condescension towards the lower classes. It was a kind of a class or even a caste response to literature, as if it mattered who was your publisher or who was your audience. Children's literature has always been a leader in these kinds of coping with catastrophe stories. And so there's no reason to be so narrow-minded as he was. I've said that often, and I hope he's changed his ways. As you said, that was 2016, and he's kind of gotten slapped around for his attempt
Yeah.
to erase science fiction. Maybe it's opened his eyes, maybe it's closed his eyes. As for the culture, I don't know, Cory Doctorow, Lydia Millett, Jonathan Letham's latest, this book, The Deluge, James Brady in Australia, uh, a woman with a First Nations name that I don't want to mispronounce in Australia, Lucy something. It goes on and on and on. If you wanted to read literature about it, which I have to say is a bit of a question, we read
Good question.
literature partly for fun. Yeah, it's supposed to be for fun. So, okay, I want to read for fun. This is a little bit escapist, or I want to enjoy thinking about other people's lives. Do I really want to drop into disaster land when that's the way ordinary life feels?
Yeah.
So, okay, that's my answer. Let me turn it around though and ask you a question.
Yeah.
Um, I think people were thinking that these big, super disastrous, super hot fires was kind of a Northern California problem, and then LA got hammered. So
Hmm.
what I wonder about, given you the topic of your book, which I look forward to reading, and your experiences that you've had, if you now that this is a Southern Californian problem too, and really all over and up and down the American West, do you think any changes might come out of that in either the way thing feels or the way the laws work or any of that?
That's a great question. I think the short answer is yes and no. I always joke that like when I sold my book, like editors who didn't want to acquire it would say like, well, that's just a California thing. Like, why would I be interested in that? And, most of these book editors live in New York City. Um, and that was always kind of like a joke where I would say, like, oh, wait till you guys have the smoke. And then, of course, they did have the smoke last year. And so I think that, slowly as these events keep happening all over, like it is starting to sink in, I think, for some people that like this isn't just a location specific thing. This is actually something like this is going to happen everywhere. And if it's not fire, it's going to be something else, right? It's going to be flood, um, etc. So I don't know. I think the LA thing is interesting because LA is such a specific place and everyone has a myth about LA in their mind, It's such a huge part of the culture. Hollywood is there. It's such, it's a symbol of a certain California. And I think that that has really shaken a lot of people. And I think it's particularly shaken people in Hollywood. And so I'll be interested to see how that changes in the culture. In terms of laws, I mean, I think it goes back. I'm not a policy wonk, but I think it goes back to what you were talking about is that the huge story here is insurance in California. And that is what the LA fires have really sort of made clear is that the insurance crisis, it's accelerated the insurance crisis.
Yeah, I ran into the previous California insurance czar, Dave. His last name is slipping my mind, I'm sorry to say, but he was great as the insurance leader, very aggressively trying to help Californians in there by overseeing insurance. And he said he wants to go back, but of course he's now out of office. But I'm interested. I saw the California Attorney General and the California Secretary for the Interior, so Wade Crowfoot and Ron Banto.
Yeah.
They were impressive. They seemed, I think we're lucky to be in California, that we actually have a progressive government. We have
For now.
um, well, I think it's a kind of a supermajority. I don't see California going right wing anytime soon. It's just too big of a collective and it's too proud of itself as what it is. A certain hatred of Texas, a hatred of stupidity. I'm very proud of California and I feel like we're in a close to a supermajority. Of course, it has problems. Of course, since we're in the world, we can't solve the housing crisis by ourselves, although we could do better than we're doing. I'm not saying California is perfect, but I am proud of it for being as progressive as United States states get almost. And it's big. It's the fifth biggest economy on earth. So, but as for fire, the one thing I worry about is, I mean, maybe Hollywood will come around and make more climate fiction movies. That would be great. TV shows. That would be instructive and it would help people always get it shoved in their face no matter where they try to look. But don't you think, I mean, Michael Lewis writes about this. A town gets devastated by a tornado and he goes to a town that's 10 miles away and he says, gosh, this is like in Ohio. Aren't you people scared? He said, oh no, that town was in this tornado track. We're not in the tornado track.
Yeah.
So there's always this idea that it'll happen to somebody else. And then even if it happens to you, like in Florida or North Carolina with the hurricanes, they still voted Republican.
Yeah.
So what I worry about is that ideas trump experience in some god-awful way.
I'm sorry, say the last part again.
That ideas trump experience, that you want so badly to stick with your ideas and your sense of yourself that things that happen in the real world still don't knock over the apple cart of your ideas. I worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do too. I mean, I think that's definitely something that's happening, like you said, in Florida, places like that. Um, I mean, I would also, going back to the idea of like culture and talking about that, I would also argue that in a way, all the culture that we're making right now is climate culture. It's just in there in different ways, and even things that are just completely ignoring it, that's a product of what is happening on the planet. I really believe that people like feel on some deep level what is happening. And I think everybody feels that, and people just have different ways of reacting to it.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's a good point. I think it actually takes a lot of mental power, force now to ignore situation, that people who are trying to stick their heads in the sand, it's a mighty mental effort. And whenever you have repression, you have the return of the repressed. So
Yeah.
then you do vote for a jerk because you're feeling angry, because you've had to expend so much energy denying an obvious reality. In other words, I think climate deniers know just as well as everybody else that climate change is real and is happening, but they don't like to say it.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, I'm interested in sort of like how your perspective, because you're so good at sort of the like Ministry of the Future is so good at this near future. And I'm interested in sort of how your perspective might have shifted on that since the election, in terms of the climate struggle and actually making a change. And also sort of how you envision the long future at the moment.
well, I think the long future now is bifurcated and you can't envision it.
Mm,
If you were to set a spread of possibilities like a scenario, a game, or a trajectory track, like in an experiment, the differences between the best possible outcome and the worst possible outcome are outrageous. And so if we were to do things right or even or do things well from now on, we would get to a really quite prosperous world that because the population will be dropping slowly because of women's rights. And you can imagine a state where we get down to, 5 billion people living in adequacy, no poverty, and people enjoying their lives in good balance with the biosphere. Fine. The utopian view. I like it a lot. But if we press the environment past certain planetary boundaries and fall into a hothouse Earth scenario, then it could get so dystopian that it isn't even worth thinking about. In fact, most dystopias are sentimental and soft edge compared to what reality will be. So
mm,
that's not even a place worth thinking about, and certainly not worth writing art about. I utterly and totally reject dystopian narratives. And I don't even like, oh, everything fell apart, but this little group of hardy people managed to do a frontier thing out in the backwoods somewhere. I feel like that too is a comforting fantasy that it wouldn't even be that good. It would be a matter of a war of all against all. And it would take, there probably would be little survivor groups somewhere around, probably First Peoples and Indigenous peoples who are always living off the land in the corners of this world that are left. But it's a terrible story to tell compared to the good ones where you try to not only encourage people, but give them things to do and show how it might work in the real world.
I have to ask, that makes me ask the question, what are you working on right now?
Well, thank you for that. And I want to ask you the same. I'm finishing a nonfiction book about Antarctica.
Ooh.
I already wrote a novel about Antarctica, so I feel a little silly, but the nonfiction book is past, present, future, and the future strand is discussing this notion of pinning down the Thwaites Glacier and saving sea level rise. So it seems like it's a worthy cause. It wasn't even in my head in 1996. I don't think it was a thing. So I'm writing nonfiction about Antarctica, and then I want to go back to writing novels. This is my great goal for 2025, although it'll be late in the year, to get back to fiction, and it will be a climate fiction, but I don't want to do a sequel to Ministry. I don't want to do anything like Ministry. I'm thinking of quick little novellas, maybe detective stories in a climate change world. And also I'm thinking about the Arctic Ocean as a liquid ocean, which would be so bad for the earth that people might be trying to do something about it. So it might even be geoengineering fiction, which as I said in my talk, these are only useful ideas if we are also getting a handle on fossil fuel emissions. What about
Right.
you? What are you working on?
I'm also working on a novel. So we're switching genres, I think.
Mm.
um, I'm working on a novel that is set in the past, in the 20th century.
Ah, uh-huh.
And it's loosely to do with ideas about art and relationships between women, especially during oppressive political times. That's all I can tell
Nice.
you right now because I don't know the rest.
Well, I think that's very appropriate. I remember, Hemingway, he was kind of a lunatic, but in some ways, but he was a damn good writer with good writing habits. And he always
For sure.
warned, Joe, don't talk your ideas out. Just keep quiet and show people the book when it's done. And I think that makes a lot of sense, even though I myself break that law all the time. It's
Do
not a
you
law,
do you
but I
have
break that suggestion.
do you show drafts to people? Who do you show them
No,
to?
that I wouldn't do. That I
Yeah,
wouldn't do. You got enough problems without showing it to other people. You might as well just be your own critic until you get it to a certain point. At
I
least
agree.
that's what I do. But I also got to say, every writer has a different method.
Yeah, for sure.
Ah, good. Carlos.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. That was wonderful. So now we're going to start the question and answer period. Again, you can put into the chat your question, indicate who it's for. I'm going to ask the first two questions. So for Manjula, you've written in the last fire season that we need to return to indigenous fire management practices of controlled burns to reduce fuel loads. And I'm curious, can you share with us any examples where you think this is happening? And maybe even where Indigenous people are being given respect and leadership in the process?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Um, yeah, I mean, just to step back a sec, the generally understood reasons for the fire crisis that we're having right now um, are sort of since colonialism, there's been a complete suppression of fire and indigenous land practices, which included anthropogenic fire and still do. That has also sort of inspired a culture of fear around fire in the dominant culture. And then we have rampant development in the WUI, in the wildland urban interface. And then we have climate change, which makes the weather more extreme, which leads to these dry, wet swings that we're seeing in places like LA, and also where I live in Sonoma County. So I read a lot about that in the book and sort of exploring that idea that, you know, these fires that we're having are generally, bad. um, but there is a thing called good fire, and there's a huge movement about good fire right now. There are community prescribed burn associations that are cropping up all over California, that are landowners and volunteers who are doing prescribed fire on their land. I mean, I should add, this isn't like a fix-all. Like if we do prescribe fire and if we do cultural fire and return sort of to this traditional ecological knowledge that still exists and that people still have and are practicing, except it's been illegal, that's not going to mean there's no more fire. So I feel like it's important to say that. But it will mean that the land is set up for a healthier balance of the elements, and the land has a better chance of surviving a harmful wildfire and rebounding in a way that is healthier and better for everyone, including the humans who live in relationship with that land. There's a group that I wrote about a little bit in my book called TERRA, Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance. They're based out of Lake County. And I think they are doing some of the coolest stuff around cultural burn. It's an indigenous-led organization, and it's associated with one of the tribal communities there, or like administered by one of the tribes there. And they are doing something that I think is so smart, which is they are using cultural fire, which is the term that we generally use to describe fire practiced by indigenous people, and also combining it with more traditional, or not traditional, but more official good fire practices, in collaboration with authorities and the forestry and all the different acronym soup that is involved in fire in California. And they're doing it in a way that actually creates good jobs for the people who are doing this work, most of whom are indigenous and from the community. So they're looking at not just sort of this practice of we do good fire, but also sort of what does that mean in our community? Who is doing this work and how are they being treated and how are they being paid, which, is a huge part of this crisis too, right? It's a labor crisis. So I could go on, but does that help?
Yeah, that is great. Yeah, and just
Check out Terra. There are other organizations like that. I would encourage people to support them in whatever way possible.
neat. Thank you so much. Stan, I'm going to ask you a question about geoengineering. um, to address climate change. What do you think the risks are and the benefits of placing hope in geoengineering solutions?
Um, as I said in my talk, they are ancillary and secondary to reducing emissions. And if we don't reduce and stop fossil fuel emissions, none of the geoengineering methods are going to work. So they have to be regarded as secondary as because we have already too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and because we're in a fight with the fossil fuel industries, it's going to go down kicking and screaming and is still burning a lot of carbon. And because a lot of petrostates depend on selling their carbon in order to avoid bankruptcy, the various geoengineering methods need to be looked at, all of them. But I want to point out they come in different categories with different dangers. So the word geoengineering is not the right word. It's a gigantic, broad category. It's like talking about, I don't know, um, hope or home or freedom or some word that has been introduced. But geoengineering in the common parlance means the bad things that bad people are proposing to get away with the bad things they did in the past. So naturally, geoengineering is bad, especially I think in a broad community that I generally agree with, the environmentalist community. But let's break it down a little. There are those methods being proposed. Let's call them climate interventions or climate repair methods. Some of them want to draw carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and put it in the ground or put it into living creatures. We want plants. We need to do that. So those, if you call them geoengineering and put a negative mark on them, you're making a mistake because we need to do that even if we did reduce fossil fuel emissions fast enough. It's already a given. Then other methods are called cooling the planet. And there you get into the one that people always think of first. Solar radiation management is what they would like to have you call it. They mean imitating the Pinatubo volcanic eruption. They mean throwing dust into the high atmosphere, sulfur dioxide, or maybe some other substances to reflect sunlight back down into space and cool the planet the way Pinatubo did. Well, okay, that's global. Once you've done it, well, truly, you could try it once for 5 years and then let all that dust settle back to the ground and call it an experiment. But it doesn't solve the emissions problem. And also, it only reduces temperature a small amount, and it's not as easy as people are talking about. And it's global. Everybody would have to agree to it because every place on Earth. Now, there's other methods. Say you cool the planet by creating a brighter marine cloud layer. That's just every container ship putting something into its exhaust that makes marine clouds brighter. It's local, it's reversible, it's modular. If people didn't like the effects of it, if it seemed to be creating problems, first of all, it's hard to imagine what those problems might be. Secondly, you could always stop. So the cooling the planet methods are different than the drawing down carbon methods. And then lastly, this cryosphere stuff of thickening the Arctic sea ice or tacking down into place or causing the big glaciers of Antarctica, the ice sheets, to stay where they are for 500 years. That's a different category yet again. So one thing to do is to immediately interrogate when you hear the word geoengineering, what are they really talking about here? Which one of the methods? Usually it'll be solar radiation management, which is problematical and is kind of the in emergency break glass. If tens of millions of people are dying from heat and humidity spikes, wet bulb events, as in the first chapter of Ministry for the Future, then there might be countries, as in my novel, India might say, "Look, we're cooling this planet down right now, and we don't we're tired of dying." People in Pakistan, when the method is described to them, they say, "Do it, please, do it now. We need it. We need it badly." So that one is got most of the publicity, most of the flack, most of the angst, and yet it isn't really the main one because we can try smaller, more local projects first. And we do need to draw down carbon dioxide, and we may need to cool the planet. And it would be great if we could help the ice on the planet get through the hot time. So this is my thoughts about geoengineering.
Great. Thank you so much. You've given me a new appreciation of the subtlety of the word and that it really can mean a bunch of different things. Okay, now we are going to audience questions. So the first question for both of you is, in the last few weeks, it's been hard not to have Musk's dismantling of the government overshadow everything. Do you think we need to fight that battle first? And if so, how? Or can we make significant carbon reductions even in a radically revised US government? Small question.
Manjula, you want to go? I think you're muted.
You're on mute.
Classic rookie mistake. I will just say that the thing that I think is actually really interesting in terms of climate activism that has happened in the past few weeks as we've watched what is happening, is it's been clarifying, right? I mean, I think it's been clarifying that institutions aren't necessarily going to save you. And we always have known that. And we're doing great work to change institutions. But I think that I at least have felt that on a really deep level the last few weeks, where it's like, oh, the government isn't just like doing its thing, like they're actively, trying to do harm in this very clear way. And I think that, there has been a renewed sort of focus on local action in that way and local activism. And I'm a big proponent of that. I think, part of the story of my book is the story of me sort of learning to understand community in place and how that is ultimately like not just a way to survive, but a way to make change. So I have been looking to local organizations and local people, mutual aid, but also direct action.
Great. Stan?
Yeah, I think that this digital coup, as Timothy Snyder's called it, by Musk and Trump is incredibly dangerous, and it will kill millions and is worth fighting tooth and nail all across the board. If one political party in the United States, when it's a two-party system, has become a kind of a death cult, then the other party really does have to step up and organize its fight and resistance for the citizens who care to stay on a sane planet. The Democratic Party has often been disappointing because of the kind of attempt to be Republicans light ever since the Clintons, especially. So that's bad, but you can talk to your mainstream Democratic representatives. In California, we've got a lot of them, and they're usually quite good, and yet they are also usually quite conventional in their thinking. And so I've been sending money to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, as a symbol of a really intelligent uh, campaign, a political campaign of trying to tell people that a resistance is necessary now and to not back down in times of trouble like this. And I wish the Democratic National Committee was run by AOC. So one can say that, one can help with that, one can try to make that happen. And California is one of the most progressive states, and making alliances with the other progressive states. The 19 attorney generals that sued to stop some of this Musk damage and got a court to put out injunctions. Right now, we'll see a constitutional crisis if the courts really do put out injunctions and say, stop this damage and continue to let the government work as it has been working. And then if the administration ignores that and continues to damage, you get quickly to a really quite extreme constitutional crisis that I don't think we should sleepwalk into. You can see it coming. At that point, I want to say this, as an old anti-Vietnam hippie from the 60s and 70s, I find it surprising to say this. I take a lot of comfort in the US military, especially the officer corps trained in West Point and Annapolis. These people are history majors, and they are not capitalists. They're not out to make a profit. They're out to defend the United States. I and many others have been trying to convince them that the defense of the United States includes its land, and that the Department of Defense is also defense of the land and all the living creatures of the United States. They are not completely averse to that line of thought. And when I say they, that's a big, complicated agency, but they are not going to do illegal things at the behest of a fool who they hate and who hates them. So maybe in the constitutional crisis, we will shudder like a big pile of jello. Maybe things will be wrecked. And I noticed here in Village Homes, Davis, California, a group of people came in and wrecked things. It took them about 4 months in Village Homes. It's taken us 4 years to fix it.
That's
And
the
that,
community you live in?
yeah, it's just 800 people in a community of 200 homes. It's nanopolitics. It isn't even micropolitics, it's nanopolitics. But I'm in the thick of it there. I recommend everybody get in the thick of their local politics because you can actually make a difference and you can see the people you're talking to and fighting against even. But I'm going to say what damage gets done at the federal level right now, it may take years to undo it later on. But I trust in I got a new passport today, and right on the passport on the top page it says that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. And the shall not makes it a science fiction story that I often recount, an 18-word utopian science fiction story because shall is in the imperative future tense. And that's in our passport. I feel like the mania will, it might be a case right now that the worse they are, the better it is, in that they will completely delegitimate themselves in this digital coup. But, we're in the midst of it, so no predictions.
Yeah, I get really nervous when my biggest hope is the military.
Who would have said it?
Right?
Yeah.
Well,
But
I spoke to them. I spoke to one of their planning groups last summer, and I said, "Look, folks, if this election goes wrong, you may be having to contemplate Article 25, but you may have to be contemplating Nuremberg. You understand Nuremberg, that it's illegal to follow an illegal order." They all nodded like, "Oh, come on, old man, we know that story. We war game that story every week." It was not news to them that they might be facing Nuremberg type choices, and it seemed to me they were going to come down on the right side of that.
I am hoping we see more sort of mass civil disobedience and more direct action from regular people as well as the military. I think, we are definitely at a point where, I mean, some could argue we've always been at that point, but we're really glaringly at a point where you have to look at a law and decide whether or not a law is just, and you don't have to obey, and maybe you aren't going to obey it if it's not just.
I agree. I think a gigantic mass demonstrations, really big, like the ones that happened in DC after Trump was elected the first time. I don't think energy ought to be sucked out. This is even more dangerous. I would love to see millions of people absolutely stuff the public spaces of Washington, D.C. And I'm a little surprised it isn't happening. People may be rocked back, they may be discouraged, they may have gotten cynical, God knows what, but I think it would help a lot to have the world see that truly millions of Americans hate what's going down.
here's a second question, kind of relates to this. Manjula, throughout your book, The Last Fire Season, you wrestle with the emotional and physical impact of fires, leading to you considering moving away. But at the end of the book, you decide to stay and fight for your home and community with beautiful examples of neighborhood action to slow fires. How have you continued to balance fire risk and climate change with home and community? And how has your community continued to build?
Thanks for that question. So in the book, so I live next to about 400 acres of chronically neglected mixed conifer forest. And it's definitely a fire risk. And in the course of the book, there's some neighbors who get together and start trying to clear vegetation and that sort of thing that was going on that we were doing during the pandemic and during the 2020 fire year. A very cool thing has happened, which is that our community has facilitated I think we're getting someone's feedback.
Yeah, we're getting, yeah. Okay.
So since the book was written, that land has actually is in the process of becoming parkland. And through that, through a very complicated interorganizational thing with the county, And that means that we're eligible for grants to do more fire mitigation work. So that's really exciting. And actually, just this month, we had some crews up just up the hill from our house doing some pile burns. And that was really cool. It's good, obviously, for the land and the forest. It's good for the people who live in the forest. But I think the coolest thing about it is actually getting to see good fire where I live is an incredible thing. And I think that that is that's invaluable for people to experience. Um, what was the other part of the question? Oh,
The last one, how is your community, well, you really answered, how is your community continued to build?
Oh, I was just going to also add that, in terms of negotiating my relationship with what climate change and the landscapes where I live and the crisis that they're in, I am speaking to you from a hotel room because we are having an atmospheric river where I live, and my community loses about one house a year to falling trees. Um, and so when the wind gets really high, those of us with resources sometimes decide to spend the night elsewhere. So I will say that it's an ongoing negotiation. It can be scary and it can trigger all sorts of intense, trauma, and it's constant.
Great, thank you. This is a question for Stan. California, especially Governor Newsom, has been systematically undervaluing local energy resources. Do you have ideas about whether and how communities can move forward with local energy?
Yes, there are local energy opportunities. At least I'm aware of them in Ayolo because of Valley Clean Energy. I agree. I think that Newsom has not been as good as many of the people he has hired to positions that are political appointments who have been better on these issues than him. And then it gets to him and we get disappointed. Too bad. I think this is following the old Clinton strategy of trying to triangulate and appeal to the middle, looking at the national scene with the idea he might run for president rather than taking care of California. You can write your governor, you can talk to representatives, and I am very impressed by our state senators and most of the assembly people who are more proactive on these issues than the governor himself. And luckily, with in control of all three arms of the government, a lot of things are happening in California despite Newsom's lack of inspiration. And I want to give him this. He does hire really good people and puts them into positions that are quite powerful. He didn't have to do that, and yet he does that. So I'm trying not to be judgy. One thing I hate now is the idea of all of the Democrats are people left of center in this world going all the way out to the edge of stabbing each other in the back and fighting over micro differences, the narcissism of small differences, it's called. Since we're all on the same side, after criticism, it needs support. So I would, while agreeing that Newsom could do better, I think we still have to support him and push him to do better.
Yeah, great. This question is for both authors. Why do you write? Why did you choose to write a book about the changing climate? And do you have a hope or wish for how your books might influence the lives of your readers?
Just a few small questions.
Yeah.
You want to give it a go, Stan?
Well, I write because I love to read. I fell in love with reading when I was about 7, and I've never stopped. I read more than I watch things. I'm a book reader, mostly novels, but also poetry, plays written down, nonfiction. I still read children's literature. So I like to read and then I write. I write hoping that if things go well, that other people will enjoy my books as much as I've enjoyed other people's books. One thing I got to say is you'll never know that because you can never get outside of your books. You've got them semi-memorized and you have to, if you rely on readers, which you have to, they tell you everything from A to Z, from 5 stars to 1 star.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky business, and you just have to. This is where I think faith, the word that Manjula used, you have to have faith that you're in the literature game, and if you get enough good responses, you just have to say, okay, those are the people that I'm writing for.
Yeah. Every book finds its audience, hopefully. And it might not be the one that its author wants or intends. I mean, I think that's the really interesting thing to me is like having this book come out. I've done a couple other books before this, but they were collaborations, and this is the first book that's all me. And so in some ways it feels like my first book. Um, it's always interesting because on one hand, like I feel like I have ideas about, how I want the book to be received in the world. It's my hope that people find things in it to relate to and also find a new way of thinking in it. But I very much believe that it is totally out of my control how this book is received once it's left my brain. And that's part of the fun is learning what people think of it and the questions that come your way and all that. Um, I think, I have the same answer as Stan as to why I write. It's because I read. I did also just write an essay called Why I Write for Alta magazine, but it won't be out till I think June. So more about that later.
Okay, here's a long question for Stan. Your book, Ministry for the Future, suggests the possibility of stopping the chaos of climate change with some really radical changes. In order to make these changes, people have to face the harsh reality of climate change, their own mortality, traumas, self-assuredness. We see this theme come up multiple times between several key characters, from Frank, a regular, quote, regular person, unquote, who went through a disastrous climate event, to Mary, the head of a global organization who has to let go of some of her presumptions as a leader in a high place. How do, quote, regular people in the real world begin to change their way of thinking in order to take action on climate change?
Well, I can say right away that I don't know. And um, to keep talking, to keep trying to find different ways to tell the story. An earlier question in the chat asked a related question that I was interested in. The apparent loss of belief in science when really scientists are the heroes of all my novels. What's going on there and how can we fight that? I want to make one suggestion that when your life is on the line, you run to a scientist, which is a doctor. So we all need to be reminding everybody in our lives, relatives who don't get it, or neighbors, or people that we just meet by accident, that it's science that's keeping us alive on this planet, and it's a reality based, and you cannot ignore reality uh, entirely, or else it will bite you or kill you. And the idea that doctors are scientists, I think, is under recognized and important to remind people of that when they're scared, they run to a scientist. So they believe in science, even if they're cherry picking and they say they don't for one reason or another, usually a political reason. Again, we've got a 50% of the country voting for a Republican Party that is in its quote anti-science attitudes is wrecking things and is a kind of a death cult. Well, how do you talk to people in a death cult? I have no idea. But I can end on a more positive note. I wrote The Ministry for the Future in 2019. It came out in 2020. I had been writing climate fiction for 25 years, and I've been writing science fiction for 50 years. What the hell happened that book Ministry has caught people the way it has? Because I've seen it now and I've done nothing but it for 4.5 years now. Um, People still believe in stories. People still read fiction and they have to co-create it. It gets inside them. They've lived it and it matters to them. There's a weird, um, semi-mystical kind of shamanistic power to fiction that I now believe is quite real because I can see it in the way people have responded to that book. So telling stories and making connections like that, using metaphors and analogies, even though I feel very useless and squishy like an English major in a world of engineers, and a lot of stuff I don't understand and can't understand. Um, Still, the telling the story, if you can get it straight enough that it's clear to yourself, then you can get it straight enough to convey to other people. It really does seem to matter. There is some power in it. Maybe we just live by stories, and other the death cult in the country has got a different story that is more despairing, that is more filled with if I have to change my ways, if I have to admit other people are as good as me, then I'm going to destroy the world. Well, that's the Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, the story of tearing everything down because you don't get your way. That's not a good story. You can't teach that story to most kids. You have to have it whipped into you by by bad capitalism, really. So catch people young, keep telling the stories. That's all I can recommend.
This will be our last question, and probably give a little bit short answer. We're a little tight on time. What about and this is for both of you. What about the disproportionate impacts on low income and Black and brown communities, not just in the US, but around the world? Isn't it easier for super wealthy people and wealthy nations to be climate deniers?
Yes. It is. And I think that's where sort of what we were talking a little bit about earlier comes in, which is as events continue to occur, the people who can consider themselves exceptions are going to become fewer and fewer, because even if you're a freaking billionaire, you live on planet Earth, or maybe another planet, still live on a planet.
Yeah, same. We just have to admit that history has included massive injustice, and we live in deep inequality. And always try to hold on to this idea that as Americans, well, there's huge inequality in the United States also. Let's just say the top 1%, the top 10% of wealth, of wealthy people on this planet need to keep in mind that it takes everybody, and that is absolutely literally true, not just accidentally. That you can't get by on your own in your fortress island, that's a fantasy. So working on the rich and saying, come on, get a grip until everybody's secure, nobody's secure. Until everybody has adequacy, no one is truly happy because you have to repress your guilt. And try to just keep making these points that we are in a crazy system. Okay, it was laid on us. We've lived in it all our lives, but it's getting worse. And that the people of color and the poor people of the world, the immiserated, the hungry, they're taking the damage first, even though they've burned very little carbon. That's just another injustice. And so I think, yes, that's maybe a good thing to end on. And I think that actually fossil-free California is very good on this. It's not just about swapping out which way to make electricity, clean or dirty. It's also
Yeah.
about justice. That
Yeah,
that
I
is
mean,
one of the crucial technologies.
that is why we cannot separate climate justice from social justice, from economic justice, from indigenous rights, from the rights of nature. They're not different things.
Right. And this is a good point to end on. We have a couple things to do in closing here. First, I want to thank you all in the audience, for your donations to Fossil Free California. Financially, times are tight for our organization, so if you're able to make an additional donation, that would be super appreciated. The donation link is in the chat. Join me in thanking our two authors, Manjula Martin and Kim Stanley Robinson, for being with us, sharing their work and thoughts on climate change, and being so thoughtful and interesting. And also thank you to Quinn Ide, Sarah Noor, and Manjari Majumdar for behind the scenes planning and technical support, making this all possible. And then thank you for you all, audience, for being here. I think there was more than 200 people signed up, so pretty amazing. Thank you so much, and good evening.